Good evening to everybody. Good morning. Everywhere in this world. Thank for the C20 this opportunity. And let me just put you in how we will go in this webinar today. First of all, we will have just introduction about this session. And second, we will go to give each speaker 5 minutes. He will introduce his idea. Then we will come back to give you another 5 minutes after asking you some questions. And then we will, for the audience, we will take questions from the audience as much as we can. So please, who is with us in this panel from the participants, just post your question, comments on the chat box. And finally, we will closing from each part of you. We will give also around 2 to 3 minutes to each of you to close the session in this. I hope and I am sure this will be a very successful panel. First of all, let me also say that the C20 is an independent engagement group of the G20 and is a global platform for civil society organization in the G20 process, delivering civil society demand to the world leaders. The C20 community comprised of at least 1,000 from the civil society from all corners of the world, which have been channel the voice of the civil society into the G20 process since 2013. Each year, the C20 convenes voices from civil society organization, non-government organization, intergovernment organization, international organization, global policy expert, and G20 senior official ministerial representatives from G20 and non-G20 countries, activists and influencers to determine the policy solution required to ensure sustainable and inclusive society. This session is really very important while we are discussing the financing of education after this pandemic. Even before the pandemic, all of you know that a lot of advocacy we did in order to ensure that the budget from the government between 15 to 20%, and also to be sure that from the GDP to reach 6. Even with all of our advocacy, there is a lot of things we didn't succeed to do. And the SGD4 especially achievement was behind expected result. After the pandemic, this pandemic created really a crisis that threatens public financing and the capacity of the government to maintain provision of education to achieve SGD4. It seems that education will not be the top priority for share of national budget compared with other sectors as a health and social welfare due to increase of poverty, unemployment, lockdown, and etc. The 4 to 6% from the GDP expected for education from government seems unreachable due to the debt. Some essential factors are becoming more difficult to achieve. Quality of education, inclusive, gender equality, all this is under risk. The debts are squeezing national budget in low, medium income countries. Many countries are not able to pay their debt. They are just able to fulfill serving rates of their loans. World Bank Group announced in April 2020, the development of 160 billion, including 50 billion of idea of is grant or highly constituted terms period of next 15 months. This is the new loans. Austerity policies imposed by IMF, International Monetary Fund, to guarantee countries are critically restricting public expenditure in public employment, education, health, social welfare sectors are public employment. and negatively, all these negatively really will be affected in this direction. In the occasion of the International World Teacher Day, this year, joint statement issued by UNICEF, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the ILO and International Education for the Protection of Education Financing warns that without urgent action and increased investment in learning crisis could turn into the learning catastrophe. In recent report published by this October 2020 by Eurodad about the IMF lending and austerity measures entitled Arrested Development that covers 80 development countries. We found that for the group of 80 countries, public gross debt is expected to increase from 55 to 62% of GDP between 2019 and 2020. The UN estimates that the developing countries face a financial gap of $2.5 trillion per year. You can imagine this amount to achieve the SDGs, especially eradication of poverty and hunger, as well as provision of quality of health care, education, and social protection. That's why this webinar is very important for all of us. In this webinar, we have really a very active participant who will be the speaker in this webinar. Our friend Ram Kerr from Nepali Coalition, Chris Weavers from the Teacher Union in England, Zahi Azar from the Arab Campaign for Education in Lebanon, Solange Akbo from the ANSIFA, the African Education Coalition, and also Andrisa Belinda from the Brazilian Education for Coalition. Let us to start with really Andrisa. We will start with you. Andrisa Belinda is the General Coordinator of the Brazilian Campaign for Right to Education. Andrisa is part of the Steering Committee of the Latin America Campaign for the Right to Education. She is also affiliated with the National Association for Research in Education Financing, FINDUCA, if I spell it good in Spanish. Andrisa, my question to you, what is the state of funding for education in Brazil and Latin America? And how do you think the pandemic will be affected by that? How the budget, the finance will be affected by the pandemic? The floor over you.
Thank you, Rifat. So, dear Rifat, dear colleagues of coalitions from the right to education in the world at my side today, and dear all. Latin America countries invest on average 4.5% of GDP in education. The amounts per student are well below the average for OECD countries. In this scenario, however, at a time before the pandemic, COVID-19 has profoundly affected our region. America is the continent most affected by the pandemic, with 17.4 million confirmed cases. Of the 10 countries with the highest number of cases in the world, 5, that is half of them, are countries in Latin America. Brazil is in third place with almost 5 million cases. What makes us occupy 50% of the 10 top countries that have responded worst to the COVID-19 crisis. The policy paradigm adopted globally in terms of economic development in recent decades, guided by liberalizing and austerity policies, caused tremendous damage to the world and in particular to Latin America. The countries of our region, with a traditionally hierarchical economic model, with less mobility and greatest vulnerability, were very sensitive to the economic policies implemented, hugely deepening social inequalities in a region that is already one of the most unequal in the world. This led to a weakening of social policies as a whole of the region and has been the scene of political upheavals and the rise of populist and authoritarian governments recently, challenging our democracies. And what does this have to do with education? Everything. If the scenario of education in the region was already fragile with underfunding, school exclusion, and low quality, the pandemic has come to aggravate the situation even further and deepen educational and social inequalities. In Brazil, there are more than 40 million students who depend on the National School Feeding Program, who went months without receiving this food, which guarantees in many cases their food and nutritional security. More than 60% of those 40 million have precarious access to internet or technologies such as computers and tablets, which has generated an immense exclusion in terms of school attendance in this pandemic period, which is far from being over, since there are no testing policies and prevention in progress. There are 2 million students whose schools do not have drinking water, 800,000 in schools without a sewage system, and 614,000 without a bathroom in the place they studied. Under these conditions, it will not be possible to resume face-to-face classes in safety. In Brazil, the scenario of lack of infrastructure and minimal policies to guarantee rights, including the right to education, has a name: Constitutional Amendment 95, known as the ceiling of expenditure, which froze social spending for 20 years in Brazil. Since the beginning of austerity policies, a loss of $2 billion has been recorded, of which 7 billion in 2019 alone. One of the promises of the ceiling of expenses was the reduction of the gross public debt that did not materialize. On the contrary, it grew 16%. According to the light report of civil society of the 2030 Agenda Working Group in Brazil, Constitutional Amendment 95 is one of the main causes of being far from reaching the SDGs in the country. The National Education Plan, the backbone of education policy, is expected to reach 2024 at the end of its term, with 85% of its goals not met if we continue with the defunding policy. The good news was that the Fund for Maintenance and Development of Basic Education and Valorization of Education Professionals, the FUNDEB, was approved after huge mobilization from civil society and the education community and pressure of the Congress, contrary to the government's cut agenda. The new fund should bring more resources to schools, teachers, students. Still, it's far from being enough to face the crisis within the crisis we are expecting. Given this scenario, we recommend that the governments redouble their efforts to implement the recently adopted International Committee regarding the financing of human rights to education, placing them within a broader framework of the struggle for tributary and fiscal justice, the graciousness of the education, and the fortification of the public systems of education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andressa. Chris, the question will be for you. Chris Weavers, Principal Official Teachers Union, Naswat. This is how you spell it, Chris, yes? Nasut or Naswat? Chris Weavers work for the Nasot, or Naswat, the teachers union where he leads the union's political engagement. Before joining the GCE board in 2018, Chris chaired the UK coalition of the Global Campaign for Education. Welcome, Chris. Chris, my question to you, what are the trends of the international cooperation towards funding education, especially during and after the pandemic? Chris, the floor for you. It seemed that Chris disappeared. Huh? Okay, we'll go to Solange until Chris will come back. Solange Kombon Akbo, Capacity Building Manager, African Network Campaign of Education for All, ANSIFA. Solange Akbo is the acting regional coordinator and capacity building manager of ANSIFA, the African Networking for Education, a civil society education network active in 38 countries in Africa. Solange is also a lawyer and a human rights activist. Solange, my question for you is about the private sector really in Africa, which is a very sensitive also issue. What is the role of the private sector in relation to its intervention in education in Africa? Do you see the risk of funding the public education?
Thank you, Rifat. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you, C20, for the opportunity to be part of this workshop addressing education financing globally and in Africa. You know, in Africa, the role of private sector in education is multifaceted. It runs from local privately run schools provision at national or community level, generating low-cost alternative to public schools. It also go about for-profit initiative through global chains and international education companies. And we also have a diverse kind of public-private partnership in education. But in public school, you can also see some kind of privatization of education through the payment of fees against services in some public school, like exams, copy of courses, and so on. The observation that we have made on CEFA and CSOs promoting the right to education in Africa is that private schools have been mushrooming in many countries as a result of government disengagement from the sector, the lack of public schools of good quality in some regions, but also the result of political choices that encourage or directly support private education. And finally, there is also the issue of the loss of trust and confidence of parents in the public education system and search for alternative means to provide quality education for their children. The second observation is that the development of these private schools, including those for commercial purposes, is done with the support and encouragement of certain government and also at international level with the support of donors and multilateral organizations. And we can even see cases where public funds are used to support the activity of private actors in the field of education to the detriment of the public sector, which is encouraging increasing inequalities and social injustice, creating a whole parallel system of education. In many countries also, there has been a lack of political will to invest massively in the education sector where the needs are huge. We all know that Africa has the youngest population of the world, with 60% of the population being under the age of 25. It means that the demand for education is very high. And many countries are not meeting their commitment to allocate at least 20% of the national budget or 6% of their GDP to education. The COVID-19 pandemic has also demonstrated that there is need for countries to build strong public education systems which are more resilient to emergencies from any kind. During school closures, which have affected 1.5 billion learners worldwide, countries in Africa also have put in place measures to ensure continuity of learning and protect public teacher salary. But however, we have seen that in the case of private schools, some teachers were not paid their salary or they were paid part of the salary. So the government have to step in some cases to salvage, to protect the private schools for closing down. And in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, they step in to pay private teacher salary. On another note, we have also seen that increased engagement of private technology companies offering solutions to mitigate the learning crisis. The disruption has been witnessed. But again, these online solutions are not as accessible to all the learners. When you look at the electricity and even internet availability and accessibility in our part of the world. According to a study undertaken in Niger by the coalition, the current privatization of education often competes with public education at the expenses of the latter. It opposes gratuity, reducing access for the poorest and creating socio-economic segregation among others. The risk that we are seeing in the, for education financing is that the education sector is at a crossroad and all actors have recognized that there is need to rethink education to see how this education can be delivered to be truly inclusive and equitable and give lifelong opportunity to all, not only the youth, but also the adults and throughout our lives. So the growing participation of private actors in education sector on the motive to offer solutions to ensure learning is maintained has a potential effect to have governments relax on their primary responsibility to fund education sector and to build strong public resilient systems. So this is more acute in the context where the pandemic from a health crisis has evolved in a learning and an economic crisis with, which is still unfolding. We have not yet seen all the effects of this pandemic on the, our system.
Thank you, Solange. Try to close.
To close, yes. Just to end on the note, say that this continuous spread will put African countries in before competing priorities, forcing them to select between providing education or allocating resources to health sector to fight the pandemic. We want to say, as civil society activists working in education, say that governments need to prioritize education funding, to prioritize funding for social sectors, health and education together, so that we can build resilient system. But we also want to call upon G20 countries to continue prioritizing aid to education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Solange. Thank you, Solange. Actually, Solange, like Adrissa, we are speaking about really the social inequality, the social injustice, and the private sector, the privatization of the school, it's increasing the injustice and the social distance between the people, not related to the pandemic, but related to the justice. We'll come back, Chris. The question is for you. We introduced you before you left. My question, Chris, for you, which is also a very important question, and all of us now, we are trying to predict what are the trends of the international cooperation towards funding education, especially during and after the pandemic?
Thank you,
Over
Chair.
to you, Chris.
So I'll start off by making the argument that education is remarkable. It's the most sustainable resource available to us. And yeah, as every teacher will tell you, the more you teach others, the more you learn yourself. It's the ultimate sustainable resource. But that doesn't mean that education doesn't cost. Education takes money. Schools have to be built, classrooms have to be equipped, and teachers have to be paid. And an investment in education is an investment in a safer and more healthy and a more prosperous future. And we know that educated parents are more likely to send their own kids to school to immunise their children to be healthier themselves. And we know that countries that have invested in education are less likely to suffer from conflict and to have a higher standard of living. We know that long term, our aspiration is that education is funded through domestic resource mobilisation. But we know that not every country is yet in a position to do that. And there's a funding gap that needs to be filled by external investment. UNESCO, in its Global Education Monitoring Report in 2015, estimated this annual gap to be about 39 billion. That's the sum necessary to provide quality pre-primary, primary and secondary education to all children globally by 2030. But despite this urgent need, global aid for education has actually fallen as a share of total aid around the world. The share of education allocated, share of aid allocated to education fell from 14.8% in 2003 to 11.7% in 2010, and even further subsequent to that. It's recovered a little bit in recent years, but is still below even 2010 levels. So my first argument would be that bilateral and multilateral donors need to increase the share of their aid they allocate to education. And there are opportunities to turn these trends around, but there are big challenges as well. With the Sustainable Development Goal 4, we committed to realising that right to education by 2030, but the COVID-19 crisis has brought that even further away currently. We know the impact that it's had on education systems around the world, and at its peak, the estimates are that 1.1 billion children around the world were not receiving an in-school education. But as important as that is the consideration of the economic factors at play. In countries around the world, particularly those members of the UN's Development Assistance Committee, the largest donors, they committed decades ago to reaching 0.7% of their GDP spent on overseas development aid, and very few have met that. Only 4 members are currently meeting that target. And of all of those donors, the top 10 bilateral donors for education have contributed 85% of total aid to education over the last 10 years. Yet it's these economies that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. What this means is that even if those economies maintain the same 0.7% or close to it that they're hitting at the moment, the fact their economies are smaller will mean there's less money available for education around the world. On top of that, there will also be a temptation to reduce official development aid budgets as countries have to tackle a reduction in taxation and an increase in public spending. So we as a movement need to be live to that and to be making the case for education. There are, as I said, opportunities to turn these trends around. We need to make sure that the international community commits to increasing investment in global education and increasing the percentage of official development aid that is invested in the education sector. As an example, the Global Partnership for Education Replenishment, due to be launched next week, could mark the beginning of a new era in education financing and reversing that trend that I outlined. Scaled up GPE disbursement of from 2 billion a year, up to 2 billion a year by 2020 and up to 4 billion a year by 2030 would mean the education sector could have a fund similar to those that exist, particularly for health. But clearly within GPE and across the proliferation of other financing initiatives that have developed, we need to continue to fight free, inclusive and quality education. This has to be more than a tick box exercise if we're to ensure that all children and young people are able to access their human right to education. It would be easy to be disappointed by the continued failure to meet targets on external financing and by the economic risks to future investment. But the figures are quite clear. This is achievable. The share of overseas development spend on primary and secondary education increased from
trying to close.
Okay, if a small increase from those top donors And as long as they met that 0.7% target, the education funding gap will be filled. So despite these challenges, great progress has been made and achieving our goals is within our grasp. We just need to all reach for it together.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. This is really our fears that the trends also, as you mentioned, that they will focus on the private sector and on the economy much more on the education and health, as Solange said, and also as Andrisa said. That's why we are afraid that the funding, the financing for education will be decreased. This is one of our fears. And this is also has been affected by some of disasters happened in some countries. Zahi Azar, he is one of the founder of the popular education network in the Arab region. And recently he is elected as the president of the Arab campaign for education. Zahi will actually give us an idea about from the Arab region, what the impact, the potential impact of the virus of COVID-19 on education financing in the Arab region. And does the debt issue have a potential multi-layer effect? Because it's not just the COVID in this world. Also, the debt issue is really a very risky issue and will affect the education. Zahi, the floor for you.
Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to address the C20 summit. In the first part, in these limited 5 minutes, I will try to draw results of the weight of this pandemic corona on the Arab world in general. In the second part, we'll speak about the debt problem. Generally, in this corona time, we have to be aware that this is the most important event in our recent history, which is changing our economy, our social life, our political life, and questioning seriously our education systems. In the first, when Corona started in our region, most of the schools and universities, we are speaking about a percentage of 93%, stopped totally. And then bit by bit, they discovered another alternative to continue, which is the online courses. And it was used for the schools and for the universities. In the beginning, it was, we looked to this option as a simple, doable one. And most of the schools, not most of them, but maybe 50–60% tried this option as a solution, as a possible solution. But later on, we discovered that this solution was very risky. In fact, on the quality of education mainly, on the school, on the drop of the students in the school, on the inflation of the number of illiterates. And today we speak about more than 130 million of illiterates in the Arab world, not only because of the pandemic, but it was a cumulative figure. Now we are more questioning this system, because we discovered that in order to build a successful system, online system, we need the infrastructure, which we don't have. And this is a big problem. We are speaking about electricity. We are speaking about the formation of the teachers. We are speaking about the electronic equipment to be available for the students. And all this is a major problem in most of the Arab countries. So the question is still open in a time where the economy is decreasing everywhere. So, and when the economy is decreasing, the first victim is the education. It means that when you have an order of priorities, you never put education as a priority. And this means that some countries goes to 1% or 2% of the whole budget for education. And this is more and more adopted because of the COVID-19 on one hand and the decreasing economies. Here, let's go to the public debt problem. Quickly also, as you know, most of the countries in the Arab world are suffering from having a very important public debt. And in the budgets, many Arab countries are paying 50% of their resources, 40 to 60, just to serve what we call the public debt. And this means that all other items are suffering of this load of debts. And we think that we need a radical solution for this. As in a country like Lebanon, it is 90%, $90 billion. The debt in a country like Sudan, 60 billions. In Morocco, also something like 80 billions. And all this is really putting the economy in a dead end, as we say.
Thank you, Zahi. Try to close.
Yes, we are closing. We tackled this problem in the Arab campaign, Education for All in the region, and we are developing a proposal. Sure, we agree on the principle to cancel the debts, to liberate all these countries in their development, but we want to propose to the major donors to allocate part of this canceling of debts for the education. So you cancel part and you allocate another part for this. This is just
what we call it. Thank you. It's called it swap. And I will add to Zahi also in the Arab region, pandemic, debt, all this social problem, also the conflict, which is also another addition to the situation where the education will be really at risk. And regarding debt, we really, as a global movement everywhere, teachers movement, women movement, we have to rethink again about how we can really affect this crisis, what we call the debt crisis. We will go now to Ram. Ram Ram is from Nepal. He is the national coordinator for the National Campaign for Education in Nepal. Mr. Ram Gair currently works as a program manager in National Campaign for Education in Nepal. This network, it's around 36 for organization. Mr. Ram has been joined the Global Campaign for Education to be member in the board in 2018. Ram, my question for you is, how would you describe for us the role and contribution of civil society in the debate and the dialogue on the issue of financing education at this stage in the region of North and East Asia? The role of the civil society, we are trying to describe the problem, but let us to see how the civil society in your area is working in the debate and dialogue that's going around the financing education. Ram, it's for you.
Thank you, Rafat. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share the effort of the civil society networks in this region. I will share briefly about the context of our region in Asia and Pacific and some of the effort that as well in a region and its national network from the national level, what they are doing to respond the COVID, especially on the education financing. Okay, Asia Pacific region is the region, one of the regions that has the biggest population in the world, and it also has a dynamic in terms of the economic development and especially in the last four decades, because it has achieved some of the indicators of the economic development. And it's also, it comes in the top rank in the educations in terms of the PISA. Also, it has some the global competitive indicators. But however, we have in this region as lots of disparities in terms of educational attainment or learning outcomes, and especially of the women, adults, and marginalized communities. There is the vast disparities. And in terms of the poverty also, in this region, more than 130 million people, they still are in the, they are in below the poverty line. And if we see the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal, it is below in almost in the SDG. It was achieved to, what was supposed to be achieved in up to 2019, but if we see the trend of the achievements, it's below the target. So I think there are lots of reasons, because one of the reasons is the financing and education, and only the Bhutan and the Micronesia, they only are able to spend in the education sector, but other countries, they are still striving to spend as per the commitment they made in the international forum, which is a 6% from the GDP and 15 to 20% from the national budget. So considering this region is the least spender in the educations compared to the other region. And also there are lots to work for in spending the per capita cost for the pupil. If we say that the primary level is almost fine, but we need to work much on the secondary and upper secondary level. So not only the country, government level, that from the donor side also, the education budget is in the decreasing trend, and because of that, so because of the low in the public funding, so education sector has been commercialized. There has been the other private sectors in the education, they come up, that leads to the commercialization and privatization in educations. So because of the COVID, as in the other regions in Asia Pacific, so there has been the impact in the education financing, especially financing the public education sectors. So it has declined in the budgets cut because the government priorities in the other sectors rather than the education, and the education budget has been cut and diverted to the other sectors. So this has been one of the challenges, and it's also a decline in the household incomes, because most of the family and most of the communities, they lost the job because of the COVID impact, and it has impacted to expand in the education sectors. And also it has been difficult to cover the education costs. And especially the marginalized communities, they are in the risk to be out of school, and because there are no opportunities for the educations, and it may lead to the learning disparities, especially the marginalized and deprived communities. And in this context, civil society in this region, under the leadership of ASBE and its national coalitions, they are creating their database, especially on the youth, adult learners, and they're trying to build these stories. And there has been the youth action led, research and other data, especially the national level, and there is the leadership of the ASBE. And also civil society, they are harnessing the digital tools to create a dialogue and debate on the publication system that has supported to create the awareness, to push, to pressure the policymakers to prioritize in education and to prioritize the public funding for education. And also civil society, they have been active in the field level to provide the reliefs from the for the women and for the marginalized communities, and who are in the need and who are in the risks at the community level. And there has been the integration in the adult learning in the CSO relief work. Also, the civil society, government is trying to align the policies, trying to reallocate the budget in terms of the COVID, and civil society, they have been able to lobby and conduct a campaign and advocacy so that the government realign the policies based on the COVID context, realign the plan and also the budget, so that the education budget is not cut and education is must prioritized. And civil society has been able to influence in the national, contingency plan and national budget process, and also the additional budget for education in terms of the COVID. And we know that the government, they are not much prepared for the pandemic. So the civil society has been able to create the capacity enhancement to the local government, because they are the one to provide to act in the pandemic also. And so they have been able to create the sensitizations, to create the awareness in the community level. So because civil society, they are raised to there, and they have been able to provide the support to the community who are in the need and who are at the risks. And most importantly, at this period, there is the monitoring for the civil society to find out the gap and to harmonize and the fund in the community level, and also to have a coordinated effort in the community level, so that the response from the government also.
Thank you. Try to close, Graham.
Okay. And in the works that some of the recommendations that civil society provided to the government is to have an equitable and fair distribution of the education in terms of the equity and genders in the lens for education financing. And there is, and civil society recommend for the efficiency in the education financing, because there are lots of inefficiency, and also the innovative approach to education financing. And there is the need to reallocate the budget so that the education financing, the government spending will better serve to the communities who are interest. Thank you.
Thank you. As you see, all of us agree that the future is something that we have to be prepared, not just as a civil society, but all the players who play important roles in education. So the financing is one of the most important things that we have to think about. Let me ask you one question for all of you, and please answer from your perspective. Before we get to go to the audience and to see if there is any question to give it to you. My question for all of you, what changes you expect in the future? All of you speak about really problems regarding the privatization, regarding that the funding go to the economic, and regarding the declining or the decreasing of financing towards education. And there is also the health problem and all of the debt issue that not just in the Arab region, it exists in everywhere in this world. And it will, most of the countries now, they are paying from the benefit from the loans. And as I said, that's all the expectation, the loan will be increased from 55 to 62. And in this, it will not just affect the education alone, it will affect the women, the children, the people with disability, the poor, the marginalized people. So I will start from you, Zahi, because I will go from the right to the left in my screen. Zahi, what changes you expect in the future?
May I start saying that the civil society in general is not used to tackle economical problems like the debt and solutions for it. And this is a big error. Now a new era should be opened where the civil society should be really aware of the economical problem and really gather itself, all its components, to be ready to tackle this problem. This problem is not an evidence in our life. It's part of the struggle the people have to change, to make the change on all levels, including the economical level. But now we are starting feeling the weight of this problem because it is really becoming injuring our daily life. And I think that the future will be for a civil society aware and ready to act on this level. Today, it's not the case.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Ram, what are the changes you expect in the future from your region? There is a lot of people who is afraid from economic collapse, squeezing the democracy, and then all the budget for the necessary service will be cut. What other changes besides what you mentioned in your presentation?
Thank you very much for the questions. I will support to the Zahi that one of the most important changes is the partnership that is not the government alone is not able to address such kind of pandemic, and there should be the strong partnership with the civil society and other actors, including the community, and they need to be ready. And I think this is also not only the challenge, it's also the opportunity that we have the chance to restructure, to transform the system from the government to the civil society, and to better prepare to respond in the COVID. And also there is the chance to have have a better think over the innovative ideas that what supports for generate the education financing from the country level, because this pandemic gave the lessons that if the government is able to generate the finance from the country level, that may not have the impact, but how to regenerate, re-innovate the system in the country level also is equally important. And there is also the transformations in the system, transformation in the ideas, and the transformation in the approach that we are adopting to generate the financing. I think these are the things that we have the opportunity to look around and to have a better options for education financing.
Solange, like after this, what we called it learning distance, and the people forced to use electricity, to use laptops, internet. When we say the free and complementary education now at risk, do you think in this frame how you think the change will be? In Africa, especially Africa, you speak about the private schools and all this, taking the fund from public fund to support the private school. And in this direction, do you afraid about free and compulsory education, Solange?
Thank you, Rifat. Indeed, the trend that we have seen is not very promising. The option to have private actors being much more involved in the provision of education is threatening the public system. And I think that there is need of a shift in how our countries, in Africa, they understand their responsibility to provide for everyone. The SDG 4 give us a framework where the focus should be on equity, on inclusion, to ensure that no one is left behind. But we know that mostly private sector has a profit motive, which is not compatible with public education for accommodating everyone. So we really need a transformative education. We need our countries to invest in the education system, but targeting those who are most marginalized, targeting the vulnerable, people in conflict-affected, fragile states. We have many conflicts going on in Africa. We have increased terrorism attack on education sector. So those need to be protected. And when we look at distance learning opportunities, let's not just look at high-tech innovation, but also low-tech innovation to ensure that everyone is catered for. Thank you.
Thank you. Adrissa, you mentioned that the priority has been given to the economic over the health, the education issue, which is really scary. This is, it's all over the world. What other changing you expect to be? Yani, for example, in the future, do you think that the people will be more aware about this? Because sometimes all the government policies has been passed because sometimes the people, they don't know the details, the risky about their children education. What are the changes in Brazil and Latin America in general that you expect?
Thank you.
Andressa, for you.
So I think we have to have a economic and systemic change. So 3 main points that I highlight here. So the first one, tax justice, which is configured as one of the key elements to finance the realization of the human right to education, as well as other human rights. So the second point is medium and long-term recovery efforts that should continue to promote more political and fiscal space that allow increase and not reduction in social spending in public services, in addition to progressive taxation measures that collect sufficient revenue and distribute wealth fairly. And 3, it's necessary for the governments to account to the public about public expenses, protecting the resources and executing them in a transparent, egalitarian and sensitive way. These are the 3 paths that we think are important for the states to comply with their obligation to make the maximum use of the available resources to ensure the progressive realization of all economic, social, and cultural rights, and so the right to education. And without an adequate public budget, no human right can be guaranteed.
Chris, from your perspective, and you are very close to the North organization and to the union, teachers union, what you expect from this organization to do when you hear all this really risky issue? It will affect all the world. Doesn't matter you are living in here or there, on the south or on the north. All of us will be affected. What the changes that you expect it will happen in the future? I would like to see how how you see that the international organization, the teacher union, should move in this?
Yeah, I suppose I'm always an optimist, but also I fundamentally believe that we shape our own future. It's easy to see every moment as a critical moment in the future of the world, but I think the pandemic has raised questions across the world that not everybody's yet found the answers to. And I think there are two options. We might see countries becoming increasingly isolationist and defending their own interests, or we could see an increasingly global world where cooperation and countries working together is the norm. Yeah. To my mind, and I note that in the comments and questions, the role of the private sector has been raised from one of the participants from Q8. One of the clear things that this pandemic's shown me is actually the need for strong government and for a strong public sector. Not only have companies failed to provide the services that are needed during the pandemic, that they themselves have had to be supported by government to continue. I think, to my mind, that shows the need to invest not only in education, but actually in education systems, democratically governed, state-run education systems as the only sustainable way of running public services. So I don't think the future's set. I don't think there is one thing that we can expect to come out of this. I think there are options, and it's up to us as civil society to fight for the options and the future that we want to see.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see if there is a question, but there is a comment came from our friends from Kuwait, Shaha Al-Munefi, which is, I like the comment. Education has become private education has become a highly profitable industry, especially in Kuwait, where public education is highly inefficient, it's everywhere. This comment is very important because mostly they said that the private sector, the private school, almost they have much stronger than the public school, and they graduate from the private school. Usually they graduate with more competencies than who is really graduated from public school. What do you think, Solaj? This is an idea. It's spreading, and also the World Bank. I think this is idea that's like give the education responsibility to the private sector because they are much competent than the government. Is this right?
I don't believe so. I don't think that private schools are doing much better. What we need is that we need strong systems because government is not investing in public schools. As when there is no investment, there cannot be performance. We need strong investment, but we also need monitoring of the teachers. We need teachers that are qualified, that are trained, motivated. And we need the education personnel that is providing supervision to be doing their job. But for that, they need to be equipped. When there is no money to do supervision in classes, when teachers are not trained, when school infrastructure is not there, you cannot expect performance. So I'm saying that instead of using public fund to subsidize private schools, it will be better for the government to build its own infrastructure, to train the teachers, to give them salaries to be motivated so that they do their job. We have seen that in the period of COVID, when schools were closed, and where there was an ask for teachers to continue kind of learning through distance or remote support to the teacher, to their kids, to the children in classrooms. Those who were not able to do it were private schools. They didn't want to pay their teachers because they say they did not collect fees. So this system of private schooling is not sustainable. We are talking about sustainable development, sustainable education, education that transforms the world, and it cannot be done through private sector.
Thank you, Solange. There is a question came from Tamara Tamimi, as I think. Tamara, she wrote a lot, and I will read it to you, which is very important. And I would like to hear all of you reflecting this. Tamara is writing that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated a lack of investment in social service, primary health, and social welfare. This has led, as I discussed in the panel, to prioritize spending on health and social welfare during the time of the pandemic and after the downgrading education into secondary priority. The problem with that remains that the capitalist system has successfully fragmented the concept of social protection and welfare into various categories: health, education, social benefit. Thus, I argue that it is important for civil society to reframe and reinvigorate, to take all of these services as a collective and not demand their fulfillment, which would require a restructuring of the economic system away from the current new liberal models that increase taxation burdens on the poor and decrease investment in public spending towards social justice, where the rich pay higher taxes through a sophisticated system of tax practice and winded tax base. And there is increased spending on social welfare service collectively, health, social welfare, and education. I would like what Tamara said, that I would like the panelists for their thoughts on the visibility and likelihood of this. It's in the chat. I hope that you understand what she is trying to say. Andrissa, you can anybody, Andrissa, if you want, if you wish. And Chrissy also raises.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this is what I was speaking of, rebuilding our economic system and recreating another system that puts human rights in the center. So what is described in the question is the effects of the Washington Consensus that remained in the world in the last 4 decades, and we could not overcome this paradigm yet. So this is urgent, and it is the time to make another economic and political paradigm in the place that puts human rights in the center, and it is with public expenditure and taxations and tax justice, as the question was describing.
Thank you, Andrissa. Chris, but there is something that I hope that I understand Tamara will, that in order to ask just for education or for health, or let us to make it package, one that's help us to ask for restructuring the economic system. Because if we ask just for education, the health sector, they want to increase. Chris, over you.
Yeah, and I'll give 2 examples from other sectors that have arisen during the pandemic. Is that we know that we need to reduce contact between people who have been diagnosed with the coronavirus and to treat them. Yet, if you're in a country that has an inadequate welfare system, there are many of the poorest who can't afford not to go to work, or can't afford to pay for the healthcare to treat themselves and to get healthy again soon. These are just 2 very clear examples of where strong states are needed, where relatively high levels of public taxation and high quality public services and social security systems are vital to the functioning of society. If we don't learn these lessons from the current pandemic, we never will. but it comes down to us as trade unions, as civil society actors, as education activists. We need to be making that case to our governments and to the international bodies that these are the changes that are needed in our societies. Otherwise, we'll never learn.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, we have to think about what Tamara said. This is how, like, it is, how we can make even one package, and this will increase the networking. I will go to another a question which is also very important, and I will go to Zahi. Zahi Shaha Al-Munafi, she asked, is really, which is very important, the question, is there any argument for low-cost private school in developing countries? You know, some of the people say that if you speak about business school, private school, it's okay, we will agree with you. But why you are speaking about the low, what we call it, low fees, low-cost private school, which is most of the people, like in Somalia. In Somalia, there is just 24 public school, and the rest of the schools is private because it's low cost effective. What do you think about that? What the risk? If there is risky, or it's okay?
I think that there is a big risk because what is happening now is a dissociation between the public school and the private school, and the public university and the private university. What for? It seems that the market, the national and international market, decided to answer their needs through the private university and the private school. So they isolated their needs from the general education, which is in crisis in the country. They don't aim to solve this crisis of the public school and public university. They just aim to get their needs for the market from the private school and university. And this is, I think, very risky for the society because there is now two forms of education in every country. And within the private education, also there is levels, which means that nobody is willing to solve the whole problem of education. We will live like this for a long time. We have to struggle against it. All our aim is that the quality of education in the public school will be the same with the private school. And what another discovery from this is, if you want to struggle for this justice in education, you have to struggle for economical justice and also in the same time for political justice, which was mentioned indirectly in the text you read for us, the question you read for us a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Zahi. Actually, it's if we look at the education is a right, and then there is no condition. All the people, they have the same, the equal. All the children, they have to have equality, equal opportunity to quality education, comprehensive and inclusive education. So a division in the schools, it will affect the right to education for the people. I will go to Ram and I will ask Ram, and then I will come back to all of you in 1 minute, please. Next step as a civil society, what we can do in the next step. The responsibility of us is high. It's not like in the past. Now we have to think outside the box. Next step, in 1 minute, what we have to do as a civil society. Ram.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we need to build the narrative so that is a role of the civil society, that the public education systems work better. So because the narratives of the publication system is not publicized and not documented. And also we need to have the, we need to think over the, re-innovativeness on the works that we are doing in the civil society sectors, and build the coordinations among the agencies that we have the role, because the actions from the government is well coordinated and well targeted. So I think these are the things that we can think over, and so that the ultimate goal is the free quality public education system. That is the ultimate role of the government, and they build the capacity so that the government is able to provide the this education.
Thank you, Ram. Please try to be short. 1 minute, Chris.
So I go back to what I said earlier, that I'm an optimist, and that civil society is far greater than any government or any of these international institutions. We, through forums like this, through the work that all of us are doing day to day, need to make our voices heard. We need to do that in elections. We need to do that in the campaigning within our countries and cooperating internationally. I think both from a principled standpoint and also because the evidence backs up what we're saying, we can win this argument, but it takes cooperation, it takes persistence, but we can win through.
Thank you. Andrisa?
So I'll reiterate what Chris is saying. Here in Brazil, we just had the approval of the fund for basic education, and in a chaotic scenario. And this was due to the cooperation of civil society and due to the pressure from the educational community and of the teachers to have fair fund for education. So I do believe it's possible, and we are here to prove it. So I'd like to thank you all for being together on this fight, and we'll keep fighting for the right to education for everyone. Thank you.
We'll fight together. Slojan, in 1 minute. Solange, in 1 minute, please.
Thank you.
Next
I think that as civil society, we need to continue collecting the evidence, making our voice heard, reaching out to other sectors, not only education, but all the other social sectors, working together from the southern to the northern, because some of those questions cannot be only tackled in the southern or in the northern. We need to join our hands like we used to do, and we are continue doing the GCE movement. So let's have a strong global education movement reaching out to other sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange. Zahi, in 1 minute. Next step.
I think that we need really to know that we discovered now also that most of our civil society components are weak on the level of the ideology and vision. They are very specialized, and we need together, hand in hand, to be aware that we have to network more together, to learn more from each other, to progress in a holistic vision for things, tackling all aspects of life, even if we are specialized in one sector. It is all the concept of specialization.
Thank you. And I will add some points to your recommendation. I think mobilization is needed in order to make creditors rethink and re-evaluate their position towards debt of low, medium income countries. Debt release is vital for these countries so they can recover economically and fulfill their responsibilities. G20 countries should immediately consent to debt cancellation for the development countries, or at least negotiate swap of debt that then can be allocated to health, social welfare, and education G20 or governments and leaders will have a key role to play in transforming their own policies and practices to leverage and incentivize sustainable domestic financing of education alongside of the other public service. Civil society role is very important in this period to make sure that enough funding is secured in order to enforce the right to education. The strong networking is very, very important. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for this interesting debate. I hope we will continue this debate, and I hope that the global movement for the civil society and those who work on education will succeed to prevent any cut on education. Thank you for Ram Kher from Nepal. Thank you, Chris Weaver from London. And thank you, Andrissa Belinda from Brazil. Thank you, Solange from Africa. And Zahi from the Arab world, Lebanon. Thank you for all, and see you in the futures.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rifat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rifat.
And thank for the C20 for organizing. Thank for our colleagues from the C20 teams who really, Oliva and Maha and the others who is helping us in this. And they helped us a lot in organizing this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.